Europe 2018. From Austria to Sweden, Hungary to Greece, ultranationalism is on the rise. Fueled by xenophobia and a promise to fight for the rights of white Europeans, extremist groups are emerging from the fringes and onto the public stage. It's a jarring sight, but the world has been here before. The ideologies that drive these groups can be traced back almost 100 years to one man, Italy's Benito Mussolini. Mussolini has been dismissed as a buffoon, a small-time tyrant who ruled in the shadow of Hitler and Stalin. But he was no one's disciple.
We heard for years that Hitler taught Mussolini everything he knew. In fact, it's the opposite.
Years before the Third Reich, Mussolini was the architect of a movement that would plunge the continent into darkness. He called it fascism. From undermining judges to indoctrinating children, Mussolini pioneered tactics that other dictators would use to seize power.
Mussolini absolutely wrote the blueprint for how to destroy a democracy.
How did this son of a blacksmith come to write key chapters of the dictator's playbook and turn himself into a modern Caesar?
Dictatorships have had an incredible impact in the past century.
These dictators ended up learning from one another.
They're all different, but many use the same tactics.
The use of terror,
propaganda,
Control the elite, create an enemy,
cult of personality,
use violence. These are tools that dictators use to stay in power.
Benito Mussolini is born in 1883 in the northern Italian village of Predapio. Like many Italians, his family lives in almost abject poverty. His father works hard as a blacksmith, but making ends meet is difficult. Much of Italy remains an almost feudal society. While it has a limited democracy, most of the power rests with the king and his ministers. The majority of the population is rural and poor. Under these difficult conditions, Mussolini grows into a violent child.
There were elements of his personality that we could already see at a pretty young age, including a kind of attraction towards violence. I mean, this guy's expelled at the age of 11 for knifing a fellow classmate. It's something that he does again and again. He keeps getting in trouble for knifing people.
As he becomes a young man, much of his anger is directed at the backward nature of his country. As millions of his countrymen abandon Italy to seek a better life abroad, Mussolini becomes determined to change his country for the better, but he's not sure how.
Even though he wasn't religious himself, he saw himself very similar to Hitler as a man of providence, someone almost divinely appointed to heal Italy's rifts.
Like his father before him, he is drawn to an extreme form of socialism. It calls for a violent revolution that will strip the rich of their wealth and share it with the poor.
Now, Mussolini had a rebellious, hothead temper. He wanted an overthrow of everything. He was a disruptor.
This is a violent man willing to use violent means either politically or personally right from the start.
His violent nature brings him into frequent conflict with the law. July 1903. After moving to nearby Switzerland, Mussolini is arrested for allegedly trying to incite a revolution. He's deported back to Italy.
I think it's interesting that he's in and out of prison a lot. So by the time that he's 20 years old, he's come back and lived a pretty rough existence, hiding from the police, on trial in a number of cases.
But Mussolini's more than just a troublemaker. From a young age, he's a gifted writer. And as he hones his craft, he discovers how language can be a tool for shaping a nation. In time, he makes a name for himself as a prominent socialist journalist.
His skill as a journalist was absolutely central. He knew what to play up. He knew how to play on people's fears. He knew how to play on people's dreams.
In 1912, Mussolini is hired as editor of Avanti, Italy's leading socialist paper. Under his leadership, circulation doubles. He should be on top of the world. He's a crusading journalist for one of Italy's leading papers. But his faith in socialism is wavering. It seems to be moving too slowly for the man of action. He's exposed to a new movement that celebrates speed, power, and violence. Its followers call themselves futurists, and their ideas will contribute to the rise of fascism.
Futurism was an artistic, cultural, and intellectual movement founded in 1909 by a group of Italian artists. They wanted an art and culture of speed, of movement, of technology.
The futurists celebrate action, adventure, violence, and its ultimate expression, war.
Before World War I, many people welcomed the idea of war without knowing how awful it would be, of course, as a kind of cleansing force for the decadence that ruled in society. There's a famous quote from one of the Futurist manifestos: "War is the hygiene of the world."
August 1914. The Futurists rejoice as the carnage of World War I begins. Mussolini calls for Italy to enter the conflict, but the socialists oppose the war, knowing that the working class on both sides will do the fighting. They kick Mussolini out of the party. For the young agitator, it's a turning point.
He leaves his position as editor of Avanti, the Italian socialist paper, and he founds what will be the fascist newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia.
Bankrolled by wealthy industrialists who favored joining the battle, Mussolini uses its pages to beat the drum for war. In 1915, Italy enters the Great War on the side of Britain, France, and Russia. Now Mussolini must do more than write about war. He's drafted and joins the fight himself. On the battlefield, he witnesses the power of nationalism and learns how it can motivate men into action. If it can lead men to storm a machine gun nest, he reasons, it can power a revolution.
I think he realizes that the power of nationalism is something that is a massive building block for a political party.
In February 1917, Mussolini is wounded and returns to Milan. There he begins to create a new political ideology that builds on the nationalism he experienced in the trenches. He calls it fascism.
It's hard to overestimate how revolutionary it was. It was a new political system. Fascism takes certain things from the left, like revolution, but marries them with a nationalist and imperialist doctrine, and it makes an amalgam of something new.
Fascism celebrates military might, extreme devotion to country, and the superiority of the Italian people. It is also built around a promise to restore Italy to the grandeur of ancient Rome. Even the name fascism is an attempt to link the movement with Italy's glorious past. The name comes from fasces, the Latin word for the bundle of rods that symbolized authority and power in the age of Caesar.
He played on the idea that he was going to make Italy great again, that Italy, really since the time of the Roman Empire, had been beaten up in the international sphere. He talked about things like Italians are seen by the world as spaghetti eaters and mandolin players. Italians are going to be warriors, that he was going to create the fascist new man.
At the age of 35, the rebel has finally found his cause. Through speeches, through his newspaper, Mussolini spreads the new ideology. His ideas find fertile ground among his fellow soldiers.
So they come home from the war with this memory of great violence. They have shell shock, or what we would today call PTSD. Mussolini brings together all these discontents.
In Milan, and then throughout the North, he gathers a core group of true believers. They call themselves Black Shirts. They modeled their uniform on that of the Arditi, the elite Italian brigade of the First World War.
Mussolini hosts a meeting of futurists and war veterans on the 23rd of March. It's a meeting of kind of strange characters, 50 of whom decide that they're going to form the first fascist movement.
Less than a month later, they send a message to Italy's socialists. A fascist squad demolishes the offices of Avanti, the newspaper Mussolini once led. 4 people are killed.
If you needed one word to define fascism in its early years, violence, a kind of tactical violence, is really at the core.
Mussolini has a gang, but he wants an army. To build one, he uses an essential tool of dictatorship.
One of the important tools for any dictatorship is to create an enemy. They need to have some sort of enemy that they can use as a scapegoat, as a unifying force to galvanize the public and the elites behind their rule.
There's really no better way to get a dictator in a position where he will be unchallenged than if people believe he's actually protecting them, protecting their country from ruination at the hands of neighbors, internal enemies who they do not trust.
Mussolini did not have to look far to find the ideal enemy. 2 years earlier, in October 1917, Vladimir Lenin's communist revolution created a political earthquake that was felt around the world. For many, it was seen as the end of capitalism, the end of private property, the end of God.
Communism terrified people for the real changes it could bring: emancipation of workers, destruction of capital.
Following the end of the war, inflation and unemployment soar throughout Italy, and communism's appeal begins to spread.
There was a sense of emergency after World War I in Italy. The Communist Party had just been founded on the heels of the Russian Revolution. The Socialist Party was mushrooming. Workers' rights were leading to occupations of the factories. There was a situation some called a civil war.
In 1920, some 2 million Italian workers participate in more than 2,000 strikes. Factories are closed. Manufacturing stops. Italy's democratically elected government seems powerless to stop the chaos. Just 8 years earlier, all Italian males were given the vote. But the experiment with democracy isn't working.
There was almost a consensus in Europe that democracy was not necessarily the best form of government.
Democracy to some was uninspiring. It was fat old men discussing things in Parliament and never getting anything done. Compromise and collaboration didn't seem to be the way to respond to situations of crisis.
Italy appears on the brink of revolution, and Mussolini claims the fascists are the only ones who can stop it.
One thing that strongmen really know how to do is become the prophets of doom. And this is counterintuitive for politicians. You wouldn't think someone would go up in front of his people and say, "You're all doomed," like negative politics. But what strongmen do, and Mussolini was the first to really specialize in doing this, he said, everything is cracking, everything's going downhill, but I will reverse the degeneration and I am your savior.
Mussolini writes an appeal to the nation, calling on every soldier to join the fight against the communists. He takes his message to the streets, holding rallies, giving speeches.
Mussolini really knew how to speak to the psychological worry of communism. He pathologized communism. He talked about the rats coming from the East that brought a contagion with them.
Mussolini's warnings attract allies to the fascist cause. Industrialists and landowners offer financial support.
And fascism appealed to them. Fascism said, we're going to stand up for you. This is a revolutionary situation. Your interests are threatened. We're going to bring law and order.
The ranks of black shirts swell as more men answer the call to stop the red wave. To make good on his promise to help end the crisis, Mussolini turns to another tactic of the dictator.
Most dictators use violence and force to eliminate dissent from within the regime and to threaten the opposition from rising up against them. However, Mussolini used force and violence in a completely different way. The fascists glorified the use of violence. They were very clear they were also going to use violence to attain the goals of the state, no matter what the cost.
Soon, the fascist mob is unleashed on the socialists.
They go into cities and towns and they physically destroy union halls. They murder and beat up socialist leaders.
Squadrous violence was very traumatizing because it was at a local level. People would have their homes burned. They would be assaulted in the street.
As the strikes come to an end, Mussolini claims that the fascists have helped restore order. His next move marks a major shift in strategy. He helps create a fascist political party and prepares to run in the upcoming elections.
And I think one of the contradictions we see is that this is a person of revolutionary temperament from the start, but who's willing to compromise and work within the system when he needs to.
May 15, 1921. Mussolini and a handful of fascists are elected to parliament. Now fascism is more than an ideology. It is a political force. But it's clear that Mussolini has no intention of playing by democracy's rules.
By and large, fascists hated democracy. Even if they accepted, they had to work within some of its strictures. They saw liberalism as old-fashioned and something that really belonged to the 19th century. The 20th century was meant for men of action.
Just 18 months after being elected, Mussolini and a core group of fascists hatch a plan to undermine Italy's democracy from within. Once again, they rely on the threat of violence.
He believed that change can only come through violent struggle, not through elections, not through the pace of normal societal cultural change. Change had to come in a wrenching, violent way through insurrection.
October 1922. 30,000 black shirts march on Rome, seizing key government offices and train stations along the way. Mussolini demands that King Victor Emmanuel name him prime minister, the key position in parliament. While Italy is a democracy, the king still has the power to name the prime minister. If the king doesn't comply with Mussolini's wishes, he's told the fascist horde will storm the capital and take power. But Mussolini is playing a dangerous game. The king also commands the army and the national police force. With one order, he could crush Mussolini and his movement. But the king and his key ministers hesitate.
They were fearful of civil war. They were fearful of anarchy and perhaps a socialist uprising as well.
For 2 days, Rome braces for civil war.
Now, the March on Rome is very interesting as an example of the psychological warfare. There were only 30,000 black shirts in a nation of over 40 million, with an army and a police who were loyal to the king. Mussolini really posed himself as a man of order, a strong man who would be able to tame this unruly country.
But in the end, the king buckles and offers Mussolini the jackpot, the office of prime minister.
Many people, the king included, were not only afraid of the left, they were tired of all of the upheaval in general.
And they thought, well, our politics is so broken, maybe this man can fix it. So there was a sense of doing a deal with the devil, really.
The way that Mussolini actually got power in 1922 is a cautionary tale for the rest of the 20th century and today. Many people supported him because they thought they could contain him. They thought he was a hothead, and they could invite him into government, even as prime minister, and then he would calm down. And this proved to be fatally wrong.
Just days after taking office, Mussolini addresses the government.
He gives one of the most extreme speeches in Italy's history in the first meeting of the Chamber of Deputies. That's the 16th of November, 1922.
Speaking to the elected representatives for the first time, Mussolini makes his objective clear: obey me or be dissolved.
Some of the other fascist deputies start turning up in military regalia, start bringing revolvers into the Chamber of Deputies.
Mussolini's got the top job. But real power in the government goes to the political party with the most seats. The fascists hold just a handful. Mussolini is determined to change that. April 6, 1924, Election Day. Fascist thugs are posted outside polling stations throughout the country. Their instructions: grab the first man to exit the polling booth and beat him for not voting for the fascists. It doesn't matter whom he did vote for. The beaten man will be a warning for those waiting to vote. Through violence, intimidation, and vote rigging, the fascists win 65% of the seats in parliament. The victory gives them a clear majority and seemingly overwhelming power. But fierce opposition in parliament remains. Giacomo Matteotti, a leading left-wing politician, calls for the election to be nullified. He condemns Mussolini and accuses him of corruption and intimidation.
Matteotti was a brave leader, and he was somebody that had been assaulted a number of times by the fascists, but he refused to give up, and he was the person who stood up and said in 1924 that the 6th of April election was invalid because of fascist fraud and violence, and that was something that Mussolini took as a personal slight. He refused to give in or be bought off, and I think that made him a threat to Mussolini.
Matteotti knew that what he was doing was very dangerous. Many anti-fascists had been beaten up and killed, not at the level of Matteotti, but Matteotti didn't care. He was as brave as they come.
Once again, the problem will be solved with violence. Shortly after denouncing Mussolini, Matteotti is kidnapped by a group of armed fascists. He is never seen alive again. Two months later, his body is found in a culvert outside Rome. While there's no proof, many believe that Mussolini is behind the murder. As he's gained more power, Mussolini has grown more brazen. But this time, he may have gone too far. January 1925. Outrage over the murder of Giacomo Matteotti is spreading.
The assassination of Matteotti and the public outcry was the biggest crisis he had ever faced. Even veterans who had been with him since 1919 start turning in their party cards.
Mussolini must act quickly. But instead of denying his involvement in the killing, he does something extraordinary. Mussolini declares, "I alone assume political, moral, and historical responsibility for all that has happened."
Most politicians wouldn't want to be associated so openly with a political assassination. But fascism is built on violence. It had come to power on violence. And it was time for Mussolini to boast that he was above the law as well.
To remove any doubt as to who's in charge, he adopts the name Il Duce, Latin for leader. In Parliament, Mussolini openly declares the beginning of his dictatorship. He moves to undermine a cornerstone of any democratic society, an independent judicial system. He removes the 2 judges leading the investigation into the murder. Then, in July of 1925, he announces an amnesty for the men accused of the crime. Matteotti's killers are released. Over the next 2 years, Mussolini systematically guts Italy's remaining democratic institutions. He tightens censorship of the press, banning any negative coverage. Fascist squads attack stores that sell dissenting papers.
Even though some of the mainstream press, like the Corriere del Sera, had hundreds of thousands in its circulation, they were no longer really allowed to report the news. They were allowed to report on how great Mussolini was.
To ferret out potential enemies, Mussolini oversees the creation of a network of secret police.
Fascist Italy was a police state. Police had incredible power to arrest and detain people, to send them into internal exile, and that included all political dissidents or people who might seem to be political dissidents, people who told the wrong kind of joke in the trattoria.
But Mussolini doesn't rule through intimidation alone. To increase his support, he adopts several new policies.
So in the wake of the Great Depression, the regime began a program of massive public works, road building, town building, public education. They sent nurses into the countryside to teach infant hygiene to poor mothers.
These policies help make him wildly popular with many Italians. 1929. Just 10 years after the birth of his fascist movement, Mussolini is in almost complete control of Italy. Now, to ensure the devotion of the next generation of Italians, he uses another tactic. Dictatorships often use indoctrination to create unwavering devotion to the leader and justify the harshness of the regime.
You see that dictatorships very early on would start to indoctrinate the public. It would happen during people's impressionable years, when people were most likely to absorb this kind of information and internalize it and really believe it. It was about convincing people that there was no other way, there was no alternative, that this was the only type of rule that could satisfy the needs of the nation.
In the schools, old textbooks are replaced with pro-fascist versions. Even the cover of an exercise book is an opportunity to promote his rule. Mussolini proclaims, "At every hour of every day, I can tell you on which page of which book each school child in Italy is studying."
Mussolini played an intimate role in crafting fascism's message, not only because he was a journalist, but because he understood the mechanisms of mass indoctrination. His slogans that he came up with for every occasion circulated not only in textbooks, they were carved into buildings, they were even on shirts, they were sometimes on furniture, they were everywhere along with his own image.
There was actually something called the Fascist 10 Commandments that by the mid-30s school children and even college students had to memorize, and one of the Fascist 10 Commandments was, Mussolini is always right.
Piero Signorelli was born in 1925. The only Italy he knew was Mussolini's Italy.
Era un tambureggiamento continuo. Voi altri dovete vedere tutto l'apparato dello Stato, la funzionalità dello Stato era organizzata dal fascismo e perciò era seguita a rota tutto quanto. E la manifestazione, anche quando era piccola, era ingrandita dalla stampa.
Making young people committed, even fanatical fascists, was at the core of fascist ideology. The cult of youth was something central to fascism.
To further tighten his hold over the public, Mussolini will pioneer another essential tactic of dictatorship:
Dictators like to build personality cults because it enables them to rule without always having to resort to force. It enables them to mesmerize the public, to ensure that the public adores them, and to prevent threats from opponents.
Mussolini styles himself not merely as a man of the people, but as the one and only leader of the nation.
Era dipinto eroe in tutti i campi, lavoratore, giocatore, pilota, era tutto così grande.
The way in which Mussolini shaped his own image, cultivated foreigners to see him as really one of the great Caesars in the modern era, was core to the way that Mussolini saw himself, but also the way in which he represented the new Italy.
To strengthen his bond with the nation, Mussolini perfects the art of connecting with the crowd.
L'Italia fascista oramai è tale compagine, quasi bene organizzata in tutte le sue forme che non si può aspettare.
Mussolini could be a very powerful speaker, bombastic, chest stuck out, shouting to crowds, but this idea of speaking to thousands upon thousands of people at these oceanic assemblies, that was something that Mussolini had perfected.
Realizing he cannot be in front of every Italian visually, he finds a revolutionary means to connect with the entire Italian public: radio.
So under Mussolini, the radio became one of the primary sources of propaganda. And so people would gather together to listen to the Duce. Listening to the radio together becomes a kind of cohesive moment of social interaction, just like going to the movies.
Mussolini's actions quickly find admirers outside Italy as well. One in particular has taken keen notice of his meteoric rise to power: January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler takes control of Germany's democratically elected government. He does it by using many of the same tactics pioneered by Mussolini. Hitler's private army of brown shirts, the mass rallies, even the Nazi salute, all can be traced back to Mussolini.
We heard for years that Hitler taught Mussolini everything he knew. In fact, it's the opposite. Hitler came to power after Mussolini had already been there for 11 years.
People like Hitler were hugely influenced by him, so the March on Rome is something that Hitler sees as a gesture to copy from Mussolini's playbook.
But despite his best efforts, by the mid-1930s, Mussolini is facing problems that propaganda and indoctrination can't solve. The economy is struggling, unemployment is growing, and discontent is starting to spread. To help regain control, Mussolini turns to another key tactic.
Dictators often want to go to war because it's a distraction. It's a way of uniting everybody under some sort of nationalist banner. It's a way of distracting from just terrible policies or from poor performance. It's a way of preventing the opposition from ever challenging the dictatorship, because to do so, they'd be viewed as being disloyal. Mussolini was so keen to go to war because he wanted to unite the public under one banner, under one nationalist agenda.
He tells his people that the time to fulfill the central promise of fascism has come. It is time to build an empire. But in 1935, that isn't easy. Over the last 100 years, Western powers have colonized most of the developing world. Now, only a handful of independent nations are left. One is Ethiopia, a nation Italy had tried to conquer at the turn of the last century.
The Ethiopia question is a difficult one. He's certainly trying to create an empire. But remember that Ethiopia only 40 years before had defeated the Italian army at Adwa in 1896. So some of this was about reclaiming what he perceived to be lost honor in Italy in 1935.
L'ora solenne sta per scoccare nella storia della patria. 20 milioni di italiani sono in questo momento raccolti nelle piazze di tutta Italia. È la più gigantesca dimostrazione che la storia del genere umano ricordi. 20 milioni, ma un cuore solo, una volontà sola, una decisione sola.
Nearly 500,000 Italian soldiers are dispatched to Africa. On October 3, 1935, Italian forces invade Ethiopia. Although hopelessly outgunned, the Ethiopians put up a fierce resistance. Anticipating a quick military victory, Mussolini instead has his nose bloodied.
I think there was a fantasy when Mussolini began the war that it would be a quick, short war, and it wasn't. So they turned to a tactic of total war once they met resistance. They turned to chemical weapons, which had been banned after the First World War.
Mussolini orders his generals to burn Ethiopian villages and to use poison gas on civilians. More than 300 tons of deadly mustard gas is deployed against civilian targets.
We're talking about air attacks against Red Cross trucks, poison gas, really breaking all manner of Geneva Conventions.
While the international community condemns his methods, it does nothing to stop the carnage. May 5, 1936. After 7 months of bitter fighting, Mussolini declares victory in the name of fascism. He proudly announces the birth of a new Roman Empire.
La guerra è finita! L'Ethiopia è italiana!
The dictator gets his empire, but the cost is high. More than 1,000 Italian soldiers are killed or wounded. And the fighting claims the lives of more than 400,000 Ethiopians. While Mussolini's invasion is denounced by the world, it is applauded by Adolf Hitler. Emboldened by Mussolini's brazen act and the fact that the Western democracies did nothing to stop it, Hitler launches his own bid to forge an empire. March 13, 1938, Hitler's forces annex nearby Austria, followed by Czechoslovakia just 12 months later. Then, on September 1, 1939, Adolf Hitler invades Poland, triggering World War II. It is a move that will have titanic consequences for Mussolini and the entire world.
Mussolini really believes that the Nazis are going to be on the winning side and that there is going to be a Nazi-fascist new order in Europe. And he sees how quickly the German blitzkrieg is working.
Mussolini sees opportunity. He's long dreamed of making Italy the supreme power in the Mediterranean, and the war gives him a chance to make it a reality. But his generals warn Mussolini that his army is in no shape for war. The Ethiopian campaign gutted the treasury, and many soldiers now lack proper uniforms, let alone modern weapons.
So there are concerns in the fascist hierarchy about the preparation of the Italian military. There are people in the fascist hierarchy who don't want to fight the war on the side of the Nazis. There's a real split.
Uomini e donne d'Italia dell'impero, la dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori di Gran Bretagna e di Francia. Vincere!
June 1940. Mussolini declares war on Britain and France. Intent on controlling the Mediterranean, he launches a two-front war. His troops swarm into Egypt to seize the Suez Canal. Then they strike at Greece. But the Greek army pushes back and soon has the Italians on the defensive. As his generals predicted, Italy is woefully unprepared for battle against fully equipped adversaries. More than 150,000 Italians are killed or wounded in the fighting. And it's even worse in North Africa. In October 1942, the Italian forces are all but wiped out.
They keep getting defeated in the war. They're defeated in Greece, they're defeated in North Africa, and so the military might of Italy is seen very quickly to be a straw man.
But the worst is still to come. July 10, 1943. After pushing Hitler and Mussolini's forces out of North Africa, the Allies launch an invasion of Italy. 150,000 Allied troops storm the island of Sicily. Tired of Mussolini and his wars, many of his own people welcome the invaders as liberators. Il Duce all but vanishes from the public eye.
Mussolini, who was omnipresent for all these decades, he disappears from public life. He doesn't make as many radio addresses. He's not seen in public. Perhaps it's not safe for him to come out anymore.
Furious with his bungling of the war, top-ranking military officials and fascists meet with the king to plan Il Duce's downfall.
There was a realization that Italy was lost, that Italy's power wasn't anywhere near what the propaganda said it was. And I think that once the Fascist Council of Deputies realized that the war was imminently reaching Italian shores, then it was all over for Mussolini.
Unaware of the planned coup, Mussolini is invited to meet with the Fascist Grand Council, his top-ranking advisors.
They take a vote on whether Mussolini should continue to rule. Mussolini loses the vote. I think he was absolutely shocked. I think he couldn't have imagined that.
Without the support of the military, he is powerless to stop the plot.
The elites turned on Mussolini because he was running the country into the ground. The war effort was going really, really poorly, and he was making mistake after mistake after mistake.
The king has him put under house arrest and then sent to a military hospital in Gran Sasso.
Mussolini is kept under guard high atop a mountain, but he is not utterly abandoned. He has one ally left, and he's a big one. On September 9, 1943, Hitler learns that the Allies have launched an invasion of the Italian mainland. He sends several divisions of soldiers into Italy to guard the southern approaches to Germany. Then, Hitler launches one of the most daring rescues of the war. He sends an elite squad of commandos to free Mussolini from a mountaintop prison. After landing their gliders, they surprise Mussolini's captors and rescue him without firing a shot.
After Mussolini's rescued by these SS troops, he arrives at Hitler's headquarters, and the first thing he says, allegedly, is, "I'm here to receive my orders." And I think that that very clearly delineates the relationship, the changed relationship between Hitler and Mussolini. The pupil was no longer the tutor, and Mussolini had no cards to play.
Hitler installs Mussolini as the leader of the large swath of territory now under German control. The once great dictator is now Hitler's puppet. And as the Allies continue to push north, Mussolini can only make a pretense of authority. But Mussolini's time as Hitler's pawn is short-lived. As the Allies advance from the south and anti-fascist partisans take control of villages to the north, his puppet state collapses. Mussolini and Clara Petacci, his mistress for the last 10 years, must flee or be captured.
This was a broken man. He thinks about going to Switzerland, he thinks about giving himself up either to the Allies or to the partisans. Ultimately, they decide on trying to kind of sneak into Austria.
April 28, 1945. With the German army now in retreat, Mussolini and Petacci make a desperate run for the Austrian border. Their truck is stopped near Lake Como. Although he is disguised as a soldier, the most familiar face in Italy does not go unnoticed.
Ultimately caught by a group of partisans who recognizes Mussolini in an overcoat and Austrian military uniform.
The partisans set up an impromptu court, and after finding Mussolini guilty of treason, they condemn him to death by firing squad. Mussolini's corpse is then brought to Milan and placed in front of a jeering mob.
The body of Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and a number of the other leaders, the real extremists, the real hardcore, are hung up in a Milanese petrol station for the mob to laugh at.
And they hung him upside down because in ancient Rome, traitors were hung upside down. His body was left there for a number of days until some American GIs showed up in a Jeep and cut the bodies down.
Almost 25 years after it began, Mussolini's fascist revolution has reached its bloody conclusion. In the aftermath of the war, the Italian people turned their back on his ideology of violence and create a democratic republic that is now in its 7th decade. But Mussolini has not been forgotten. Almost 70 years after his downfall, his home village of Prodapio is a destination for neo-fascist pilgrims.
There are people in Italy who really look back on the fascist period fondly as a time of law and order, as a time of national grandeur, as a time when things worked. For many Italians, it was a period of Italian greatness in which Italy had respect in the world.
Fascism has come back into having an attraction for people because in some ways we're going through a moment that is not dissimilar to post-World War I. There's a lot of economic anxiety. There's worries above all about demographic shifts. And there are worries about mobile populations. In this case, immigrants are the new enemy.
And people are starting to remember the way that Mussolini tried to make Italy great again, forgetting all the horrors that had befallen Italy, both as a result of his rule and immediately thereafter.
We forget Mussolini at our peril today because many of the signs and symptoms of fascism are back. The desire for a strong man, the rising racism, the need for scapegoats, the disaffection with traditional forms of government. All of this is coming back. And we need to remember the lesson of the strong man, which is tyranny and hatred.